This rare film from 1897 shows Queen Victoria celebrating her Diamond Jubilee. It's the ultimate display of order and respect. But don't be deceived. Beneath the surface, Victorian Britain is in turmoil. In the 1890s, the modern world erupts. This is the decade that electrifies Britain, when science, entertainment, art and morality collide. And the Victorians have to make sense of it all. Now, in 3 films, Dr. Hannah Fry, Philippa Perry, and I are traveling back in time to an era when anything seemed possible, to understand what was really on the Victorians' minds.
Dear ones, if you can hear me, I'm already dead.
And please don't forget to feed the cat.
Well, I'm shocked.
Think how shocked they were in the 1890s.
I've always been fascinated by the art and culture of this decade. The daring works of Oscar Wilde. I congratulate you on the great success of your performance. The fantastical tales of H.G. Wells. Now, I'm going to discover how they were shaped by fears of moral, social, and racial degeneration.
The whole sort of cultural idea is the improvement of people, improvement of the stock.
And I'll see how the Victorians' anxieties provoked radical arguments for women's empowerment. And a pioneering campaign against imperial rule and its racist underpinnings.
The British Empire will come to grief unless it changes its methods of dealing with the Aboriginal races.
Welcome to the decade the future landed. It's 1894, and the novelist H.G. Wells is readying his new time machine for its maiden voyage. What strange developments of humanity the time traveler ponders. What wonderful advances upon our rudimentary civilization might appear. And with that, he flings himself into futurity. But the future that H.G. Wells showed us was one in which the human race had not evolved, nor advanced, but rather decayed and degenerated. Wells was a student of science, and in his vision, society has divided into 2 species. The effete, childlike Eloi, who drift carefree on the surface of the earth, but then huddle in fear of the dark, and of being preyed upon by the ape-like Morlocks who toil away underground. The time traveler's journey might be the stuff of science fiction, but it wasn't pure fantasy. This was a future all too recognizably rooted in the present. For H.G. Wells, writing at a time of widening social divisions, the Eloi represent the upper class, living in luxury upon the surface, only to be consumed by the workers, the Morlocks, massing ominously beneath them. The time machine is emblematic of the 1890s, a decade of invention and scientific discovery, but one in which conflicting visions of the future are at war in the Victorian imagination. On the one hand, the empire has never been so vast. Are the British destined to be the world's master race, robust, enduring? Yet, at home, industrialization has rapidly swollen the numbers of the urban poor. There's rising hostility to immigration. Perhaps Britain's future really is like that of the Eloy and Morlocks, one of decline and degeneration. These fantasies and fears have been brewing in the Victorian mind since 1859, when Charles Darwin challenged the assumption that species were fixed and immutable. Since then, other eminent thinkers have begun to argue that Darwin's theory of evolution might be given practical application to the human race. This social Darwinism, as it came to be called, held that human society should be governed by the survival of the fittest, and that with intervention one could improve the genetic stock of the nation. Some believe that these measures might protect humanity from the kind of social decay prophesied in the Time Machine. One social Darwinist, no less than Darwin's own half-cousin, Francis Galton, sought to push these principles to what he saw as their logical conclusion. And the name he gave to his new project? Eugenics. Francis Galton's proposition combines social elitism with outright racism. Could not the undesirables be got rid of and the desirables multiplied, he later asks. But first, Galton needed to gather data on the British people's physical characteristics. Lots of data. And in a way that anticipates today's tech giants, he encouraged people to supply their personal details and even pay for the privilege. In a pioneering exercise, Galton set up what he called his anthropometric laboratory, where for a mere threepence, he would take your measurements. So here I am in Galton's lab, got me threepence. What does it get me?
So this is the card that Galton used. And so you'd come into the lab and you'd be measured for various dimensions. Okay, so things like skull dimensions. So use calipers to measure your temporal dimensions there and across the sagittal plane there. Yes.
I'm from a long line of big heads.
There it is, yeah. So, eye dimensions like that. I'm really conscious of poking you in the eye here. This astonishing piece of equipment is here to test your visual acuity. Oh. So
what do I do?
You look through it, and you've got to see which of those cards you can still read in this slightly peculiar angle.
Well, I keep seeing the word church.
So they're pages from the Book of Prayer.
But wouldn't people know some of this text anyway?
Do you know what? He pointed that out when he wrote the study up afterwards. He realised that the Book of Prayer was a poor choice because people knew the text, and he actually suggested that a book of logarithms would be a better test because they're so boring that no one will actually know what they are. Yeah, so one of them was blow of hand in feet per second. So basically it was punch strength, and we don't have the equipment to test that, but, it's basically how hard can you hit?
Shall I?
Yeah. Oh, God, I almost glanced off there.
Sorry.
There you go. You get your little certificate, which says all of your biometrics on it, and I've got a carbon copy. 9,000 people did this over the course of a week, and I've got the biggest data set that's ever been compiled of human metrics, biometrics, and you paid me for it. It's brilliant.
Galton hopes that by building up a long-term database of people's physical characteristics, he can identify which sections of British society should be encouraged to breed and which should not.
The whole sort of cultural idea at this time is the improvement of people, improvement of the stock. We're now in the Darwinian era, so we recognise that people and all organisms change over time, and so there was a sense that if you didn't breed well, that degeneration was the result. And so people were beginning to turn to these ideas that we could improve individuals through science.
So this search for improvement, this is positive eugenics.
Yeah, and eugenics is Galton's coinage, and the word itself means good genes. So it's not regarded as a sort of toxic concept that we think about when we talk about eugenics today. Back in the late 19th century and well into the 20th century, people across the political spectrum, both left and right, are talking about eugenics as a positive force for improving the quality of populations.
Surely he'd be aware that he was straying into dubious territory, wouldn't it?
He was definitely a racist. But we have to contextualise that because everyone was more racist then than we are today. I think that Galton was particularly racist even for the 19th century. And that's documented in various things that he wrote. When he was younger, he travelled in Africa extensively, and he came back more assured of the natural hierarchy of people around the world.
More convinced.
Yeah, and these are all part of the ideas which are rooted in what we now call scientific racism. And they're also massively tied into the whole concept of European expansion and empire, colonialisation.
Inevitably, the use of scientific racism to bolster imperial rule will come under attack from Britain's colonial subjects themselves. But the work of another scientific racist provokes a more unexpected response. Cesare Lombroso is the founder of the Italian school of positivist criminology. He's convinced that the so-called born criminal is identifiable by certain anatomical features, such as handle-shaped ears, protuberant jaws, and even excessive tattooing. The notion that someone's moral character could be manifested in their features sparks the interest of a certain young writer, soon to become one of the 1890s most iconic figures.
An idea begins to form in the mind of Oscar Wilde. What if a painted portrait could capture its subject's moral decay and degeneration, while the sitter himself remained unblemished?
The idea quickly becomes the basis for The Picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde's first and only novel. The story revolves around the handsome title character Dorian Gray and the fashionable society painter Basil Hallward, who paints Gray's portrait and becomes infatuated with him. Gray soon embraces a life of hedonism, but to do so, he sells his soul in a Faustian pact, ensuring that the picture, not he, will bear all the physical signs of his immorality. He found himself at first gazing at the portrait with a feeling of almost scientific interest. That such a change should have taken place was incredible to him. Was there some subtle affinity between the chemical atoms that shaped themselves into form and colour on the canvas, and the soul that was within him? He shuddered and felt afraid, and going back to the couch, lay there, gazing at the picture in sickened horror. The novel divides opinion, condemned by critics as unclean and effeminate for its homoerotic undertones. Some people even begin to wonder whether Dorian Gray is, in fact, a portrait of Oscar Wilde himself.
In A Taste of Things to Come, Wilde is forced to defend himself. He states there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That's all.
Wilde's book is one of the first works to be feverishly discussed by a select gathering of self-styled aesthetes and self-proclaimed decadents. Embracing what others regard as affected, even offensive, they want to liberate art and literature from staid Victorian convention and morality. Inaugurated by the poet W.B. Yeats, the rhymers, as this group is called, often convene here at the old Cheshire Cheese Pub on Fleet Street. Tucking themselves away in an upper smoking room.
And these rhymers and the decadents and the aesthetes, were they, I mean, are they one and the same? Were they all the same people?
The aesthetes had ideas of aestheticism, the love of beauty for its own sake. The important thing, if you were painting pictures, was not to tell a story, but just to be beautiful. The idea that if you were writing, it was to write beautifully. Decadents, I think, have sort of more of an idea of trying to, as it were, change things, undermine old and established and boring and stale ideas.
So what did they actually publish?
What was completely different was the Yellow Book, which became the great symbol. This is the first number of the Yellow Book, with a cover by Aubrey Beardsley, the most significant 1890s decadent artist. The Yellow Book sort of became almost symbolic of the age. You know, we still talk about the yellow 90s, even now.
And why yellow? What was the significance of that colour?
Yellow wrappers were the way in which lubricious French novels were published. And I think it's certainly the case that they could suggest that here was something new and modern and slightly dangerous. And of course, in many ways, the Yellow Book was actually launched on the back of the notoriety that Beardsley had already achieved a few months earlier when he'd illustrated Oscar Wilde's play Salome, a set of illustrations which he made for the book, which were absolutely scandalous. The publisher, John Lane, said that you have to look at all of Beardsley's drawings upside down and through a magnifying glass to make sure that he's not slipping in something.
Sneaking something through.
The wonderful thing is that half the time they did all miss these details. I can show you a typical example. Here's one of Beardsley's drawing of Herodias appearing with this very dubious, effete page. Here we see Oscar Wilde caricatured as though he's a sort of vulgar showman putting on this tawdry play. And then if you look across the bottom here, you can see the candlesticks are all quite clearly indecent little penises.
Well, I'm shocked.
Think how shocked they were in the 1890s.
Absolutely.
You know, here's another example which we can see. This is called the Toilette of Salome. And he's got Salome here sitting at a very modern-looking dressing table.
This is a little hermaphrodite.
Yes, he's very clearly a hermaphrodite figure. But this figure here, this is the one that really upset people.
Why?
Because if you see, this is sort of a strange boy who's got a curved spine.
It's very vulnerable.
And the curved spine at that time was an absolute indicator of degeneracy. And if you think about sort of the writings of sort of Lombroso and Galton, all those sort of people who were studying the decline of the race in a scientific way, the curved spine was supposed to be indicative of constant masturbation. So Beardsley's playing with current ideas that were quite coded.
You mentioned Galton and Lombroso, so it's like you have art and science almost talking to one another.
I think that's very much a thing of the time. The writers and artists thought that they were doing something interesting, clever, but at the same time, you know, scientists begin to look for signs within art and literature of the decline that they've been describing scientifically.
But what if art isn't just a sign of racial decline, but an actual cause, like heredity? In early 1895, one man, drawing on the latest scientific thinking, takes a vehement stand against art for art's sake. This is Degeneration by Austro-Hungarian physician Max Nordau. And in it, he argues that society is suffering a severe mental epidemic, a kind of black death of hysteria and degeneration. And it's on the aesthetes and the decadents that Nordau firmly pins the blame. Books and works of art, states Dr. Nordau, exercise a powerful suggestion on the masses. And it is from them that an age derives its ideals of morality and beauty.
Degeneration goes down a storm. This is the 7th edition, printed just 6 months after the first English publication in February 1895. And here you can see the dedication to his great mentor, Lombroso. Nordau argues that degenerates are not always criminals, prostitutes, lunatics, or anarchists. Sometimes they're authors and artists, and if their works are absurd or antisocial, they exert a disturbing and corrupting influence on a whole generation.
And there's one artist in particular who Dr. Nordau singles out as the epitome of this corrupting influence.
The egomania of decadentism, its love of the artificial, its aversion to nature and to all forms of activity and movement, have found their English representative among the aesthetes, the chief of whom is Oscar Wilde.
It is asserted, continues Nordau, that he has walked down Pall Mall in the afternoon, dressed in doublet and breeches, with a sunflower in his hand, the quasi-heraldic symbol of the aesthetes.
Nordau couches his attack in the scientific terminology of the time, denouncing Wilde's attire as the pathological aberration of a racial instinct. But Nordau's stance is that of the stiff Victorian reactionary. Wilde, who'd lectured widely on fashion, was forging a look, a persona, an identity. And as he said himself, a well-tied tie is the first serious step in life.
For Nordau, the sartorial aesthetic of the dandy is at odds with a natural instinct for sensible, practical clothing. Yet, despite their differences, he and Wilde agree that clothes maketh the man.
I think for anybody that puts on a performance, clothes, costume, help build a character. Or as my favorite Soho tailor says, it's your armor.
And Wilde seems to be in a combative mood on the opening night of his first hit play, Lady Windermere's Fan, in February 1892. The play, which explores the hypocrisy of Victorian attitudes to women and sex, is the first in a series of popular social satires.
I suppose, Windermere, you'd like me to retire into a convent or become a hospital nurse or something of that kind. That is stupid of you, Arthur. In real life, we don't do such things. Not as long as we have any good looks left, at any rate. No, what consoles one nowadays is not repentance, but pleasure. Repentance is quite out of date.
At the final curtain call comes rapturous applause and cries of "Author, author!" Oscar Wilde steps out on stage and addresses his public in typical fashion. Ladies and gentlemen, I have enjoyed this evening immensely. The actors have given us a charming rendering of a delightful play. And your appreciation has been most intelligent. I congratulate you on the great success of your performance. Which persuades me that you think almost as highly of the play as I do myself. The evening is a triumph, but there are those who are outraged, not by the play, but by the playwright.
Some find Wilde's impromptu speech patronizing and impertinent. Others are scandalised at the lit cigarette that Wilde puffs at in the presence of ladies. But what really seems to get to them is the vibrant flower Wilde sports in his lapel, a dyed green carnation.
With its unnatural hue, Wilde is playing with one of his most decadent ideals, that life should imitate art and not the reverse. He's arranged for some of the male leads to wear them. He's out to provoke, hoping this speck of mystic green, as he calls it, will annoy his critics. And it does.
That abnormality in the way of aestheticism recalls to mind various...
The ghastly green carnation. It is crude enough to set one's teeth on edge and affect the observer with cholera morbus.
Outrage public opinion and propriety of behaviour, he would do anything.
The green carnation may have caused offence, but more subversive was Wilde's portrayal of the Victorian woman. Lady Windermere's Fan and his plays that followed challenged the conventions of marriage and motherhood. Wilde seems to be in solidarity with the growing movement of female writers who are known as the New Women. These writers, such as Sarah Grand, Mona Caird, and George Egerton, portray new ideas of femininity. Their heroines are independent, educated, and sexually autonomous, and reflect the newfound freedoms of the middle-class woman, such as cycling, practical or rational dress, and even for some, smoking. The new woman is endlessly discussed and debated. Some observers think she's but a passing fashion, and like Oscar Wilde, she quickly becomes an easy target for Punch magazine and its leading cartoonists, such as Edward Linley Sambourne, who completed his drawings here at his London home.
And here we have the caricature of the new woman. And so
She's holding the key.
Yes, yes. Well, this is George Egerton, and she had published Keynotes, a collection of short stories, the year before. And they were disruptive, experimental stories with strong female protagonists. But you can see around her the products of a riotous imagination. So we have Tyrant Man slain, Decorum slain, Punch is expressing hostility to the intellectual woman. And the quotation here from Don Quixote, a world of disorderly notions picked out of books, the suggestion that her ideas have come from her reading.
And that was considered a threat.
Yes.
She's being lampooned because she's a threat.
Yes.
So this is another one lampooning the new woman.
This is by a different artist. It's by George du Maurier. But you also see very mannish women here. These two are wearing ties and they're smoking, and they're repellent to a man of their own class. Jack would rather take tea with the servants than spend time with them.
And who coined the term? Where did the term come from, New Woman?
Well, Sarah Grand introduced the phrase new women in her best-selling novel of 1893, The Heavenly Twins. By the end of the century, over 100 novels had been written by or about the new woman.
But if they were only in novels, why the threat? Why the perception of threat?
Well, they weren't only in novels, and there was so much change in urban spaces in particular. You had so many more workers and consumers that were women. So even if you hadn't read any new woman fiction, you would have had a sense of the new woman in some guise.
So is Sarah Grand at the forefront of this movement?
She is, yes, though she distances herself from the term and says she had meant something very different from the caricature of femininity that you see in the pages of Punch. What she meant by the new woman was a new type of duty. She wanted a citizenship of contribution rather than entitlement. And at the centre of her politics was a racial idea, the idea of eugenic feminism.
Meaning?
That she thought that women should play a leading role in regenerating the British imperial race. The middle class should breed more and the working class should breed less.
This unsettling idea about the new woman's role in selective breeding runs through much of Sarah Grand's fiction. It even inspires the heroine's name in her short story, Eugenia.
She was, in fact, essentially a modern maiden, richly endowed with all womanly attributes, whose value is further enhanced by the strength which comes of the liberty to think. With such women for the mothers of men, the English-speaking races should rule the world.
It comes of the liberty to think. Well, this is progressive.
Yes, that's right. She did have some progressive ideas, but it coexists with a deeply repressive idea of eugenics.
Sarah Grand imagines a future where the health of the nation is secured through the sexual choices of middle-class women. Such freedom is not for those they consider to be of lesser stock. For eugenicists, one way of keeping a degenerate working class in check was incarceration, which in the Victorian age meant either prison or, increasingly, The asylum. When it opened in 1848, Denbigh Asylum accommodated a mere 70 patients. But by the 1890s, the site had been expanded to serve the whole of North Wales and houses over 500 patients. According to records, the most frequent cause of admission to Denbigh during this period is hereditary influence, which essentially meant that degeneration was inherited. If left unchecked, physical, mental, and moral defects would be passed down, creating an increasingly unfit population. The situation is critical. Overcrowding and severe staff shortages mean that in one women's ward, there are but 3 nurses supervising 46 very troublesome female patients. In a case that could have come from the pages of a New Woman novel, one female patient, Janet Maud Wise, was admitted here, having become so intent on doing the things that people do in books that she'd taken to stalking young men. Janet's case notes describe her as deluded, often abusive. And they also state that at one point she asked the doctor to cut off a piece of her tongue because she said she could no longer control it. But it isn't just female transgression that is treated here. Sexual intemperance and sexual self-abuse are listed as causes of male admissions. And among the preventative devices used in asylums is one which can quite literally stem the flow of man's moral weakness. Now this might look like a pocket watch without its inner workings, but it is in fact a device to prevent what many Victorians saw as a symptom of degeneracy, masturbation, or self-pollution, as they preferred to call it. These anti-masturbation devices were often worn at night to prevent nocturnal emissions. Doesn't leave a lot to the imagination. Essentially, the old chap was held in place by this inner ring and was quickly subdued by this outer barbed ring at the onset of an erection. Renouncing masturbation was one of the aims of new social purity groups, who pledged sexual restraint among married men and chastity among unmarried ones. But their crusade wasn't just Victorian prudishness. It reflected a growing belief that masturbation was highly injurious to health and could even be sapping the vitality of the nation. Doctors warn men to conserve their essence, stating that the wanton waste of semen can lead to a range of disorders, from nervousness to paralysis, and ultimately, the descent into madness. The case notes for 19-year-old Norman Owen, a vicar's son admitted here in October 1890, refer simply to the insanity of masturbation. His notes go on to describe him pacing the ward, head hung down, needing to be force-fed, and even placed in strong clothing in a padded room. After just a year in this place, he was deemed incurable. But perhaps the most telling document concerning poor young Norman is the copy of a letter that he wrote to his parents. It says simply, "Dear Papa and Mama, of course you know that I'm a devil and that I will go to eternal hell. The asylum helps keep so-called degenerate behavior out of sight and out of mind. But sexual transgression is about to intrude into the Victorian consciousness as never before. It will take the form of one of the most infamous trials of the 1890s. The opening of The Importance of Being Earnest in February 1895 sees Oscar Wilde at the height of his fame. Victorian society is enthralled to him, all except for one man. The Marquis of Queensberry has become incensed by his son Bosey's intimate relationship with the playwright. On the 18th of February, he seeks out Wilde at his club to confront him, but without success. So Queensberry asks the staff to pass on an inflammatory message.
When Wilde arrives at the Albemarle Club some 2 weeks later, he's handed an envelope containing Queensberry's visiting card. The message reads, "For Oscar Wilde, posing as Sodomite," clearly meant as sodomite. You can imagine Wilde staring at this little scrap of card, wondering what his next move should be. It's a defining moment, and one that could have had a very different outcome if Wilde had simply done this.
But he does no such thing. Encouraged by Bosey, who detests his father, Wilde launches a criminal libel suit against Queensberry, at huge personal risk. To avoid conviction, Queensberry need only prove his accusation of sodomy to be true. His lawyers set about gathering evidence of Wilde's illegal assignations with young men, many of which began here in Soho.
It was often here at Kettner's restaurant that Wilde would lavish his young lovers with dinners, gifts of silver cigarette cases before plunging into an illicit sexual underworld. It was like feasting with panthers, he said. The danger was half the excitement. All of these encounters, including when Wilde reportedly fed preserved cherries to rent boy Charles Parker, here in the Champagne Bar, would over the coming weeks be dredged up by Queensberry's legal team, who seemed hell-bent on destroying Wilde.
Queensberry is speedily acquitted, and Wilde himself now put on trial. His private life is exposed in salacious detail.
Order!
His work is used against him. Dorian Gray cited as proof enough of unnatural vice. It's not just Wilde in the dock, but everything he stands for. The judge describes it as the worst case he's ever tried. Found guilty of gross indecency, Wilde is sentenced to 2 years with hard labor.
In his prison cell, Wilde now looks to science to exonerate himself. He composes a petition in which he states he's been suffering from the most horrible form of erotomania, and that this sexual madness is a disease to be cared for by a physician, rather than a crime to be punished by a judge. And to lend weight to his argument, he even cites his great critic Max Nordau's damning attack on him in Degeneration.
But it's a desperate plea for clemency, and ignored by the Home Secretary. Wilde is to be an example to all, a vindication of all that Max Nordau had warned against. Once free, though, Wilde would have the last word.
On his release from Reading Jail in May 1897, Wilde told friends that the fact that he was a pathological problem in the eyes of German scientists was interesting only to German scientists. I quite agree with Dr. Nordau's assertion, he said, that all men of genius are insane. But Dr. Nordau forgets that all sane people are idiots.
Fearing further persecution, Wilde goes into exile, travelling under the name Sebastian Melmoth, never to see England nor his wife and children again. Wilde's story as the most famous gay writer of the late 19th century stands in sharp contrast to that of an altogether less ostentatious author, one who draws on Victorian theories of sexuality in a quiet but genuine attempt to make sense of his own experience, and who leaves a groundbreaking legacy, despite being all but forgotten today. John Addington Symonds was a highly respected man of letters and an expert on the Italian Renaissance. Symonds was married with children, but like his near contemporary Oscar Wilde, he lived a double life. Since his youth here in Bristol, he'd harbored strong desires for men. But Symonds conducted his liaisons with far more discretion than the flamboyant Wilde. There were no public displays of affection, no preserved cherries, no green carnations. Symonds left behind an extraordinary document which could have seen him suffer the same fate as Wilde, and which survives intact under lock and key at the London Library. So this is the actual memoir of John Addington Symonds.
It is the handwritten document itself.
Of course, this was all illegal. The way he was living was illegal. Even writing about these things was illegal. So if this was so dangerous and incendiary, why did he write it?
It's either a very brave or a very foolish thing to do, but I think it's brave. So he sets aside all his paid work in 1889 and spends 3 to 5 months just writing this really feverishly. And what he says is that he's writing it for a future audience, a scientific audience that might use this as primary evidence of the development of sexuality. He tracks his sexual development from very, very young and starts with early sexual fantasies. He says they're essential for a proper understanding of my vita sexualis, my sexual life. His earliest sexual experiences at school, sort of cultures of abuse and bullying and blackmail at Harrow and then at Oxford. And this page is one of my favourites because it's got a hole in. You can actually see a cut-out hole in the middle here where a name has been removed. The name is Vaughan, and that was his headmaster at Harrow, and he's at the centre of a sexual scandal. So there might be a reason why he would remove his name.
Look at that. Was homosexuality used then as a term?
It exists by this point. The word homosexual exists, and Symonds doesn't like it. He doesn't like it because it mixes Latin and Greek. And that's his reason for not liking
he's a bit sniffy.
it. He's very sniffy about it. The term that he finds, that he discovers in his reading and that he really latches onto is sexual inversion.
And what's actually meant by the expression? What did he understand it to mean?
Sexual inversion literally just means the normal sexual instinct, the so-called normal sexual instinct, the wrong way round. But Symonds, I think, is interested in its vagueness, that it's not naming a specific type of practice or type of person.
It's kind of poignant, isn't it? It's like it hasn't stopped. We're in this age where we have myriad names for sexuality. It's like we're still looking for a term that's non-judgmental. Inspired by his research, Symonds has a daring idea. He approaches a leading physician, Henry Havelock Ellis, proposing that they collaborate on a scientific survey of homosexuality. The resulting book gathers 36 anonymous case studies, first-hand testimonies drawn from ordinary members of the public.
And what's really amazing is that Symonds includes himself. He's case study 18 here. Englishman, independent means, aged 49. It's incredibly sexually explicit. And it even includes a list here of the kinds of sexual activities that Symonds preferred in later life in particular. So in the third period, the gratification became more frankly sensual. It took every shape: mutual masturbation, intercrural coitus, fellatio, irrematio, always according to the inclination or concession of the beloved male. And this book is very rare because most copies of this edition were bought up by Symonds' family and friends and destroyed because they were very nervous about having his name on a title page next to the word sexual inversion. They were trying to protect his posthumous reputation. Symonds' material and his contribution remains in print, but he's just not given the credit for it.
He becomes a footnote.
He actually becomes a footnote. His material moves into the appendices and he gets written out of the history of this book.
Published in Britain in 1897, Sexual Inversion is now acknowledged as the first English medical textbook on homosexuality. Questions of sex and gender also lie at the heart of a very different kind of book. Unleashed on an unsuspecting public that same year, in a fashionably decadent yellow cover, Bram Stoker's Dracula.
When he leaves England for Transylvania, the main protagonist, Jonathan Harker, is portrayed as masculine, rational. But during his stay, or rather imprisonment, at Castle Dracula, his gender becomes confused. Harker becomes slowly transformed, not into a vampire, but progressively feminized. The Count takes his possessions, begins to control his every move. And Harker becomes hysterical and passive, like the archetypal Victorian woman.
This gender fluidity in Dracula is just one of its many topical tropes. Stoker clearly has his finger, or should that be teeth, on the pulse of the age, and infuses Dracula with many of the decade's chief preoccupations, including the new woman.
Lucy Westenra is the racy young temptress, toying with 3 suitors, whose promiscuity, or moral weakness, enables Dracula to prey on her. Then, as one of the undead, she becomes the monstrous antithesis of the ideal Victorian mother, leaving her tomb each night to prey on a succession of defenseless children.
With a careless motion, she flung to the ground, callous as a devil, the child that up to now she had clutched strenuously to her breast, growling over it as a dog growls over a bone.
Lucy's friend Mina, on the other hand, stands for everything Stoker sees as morally upright and respectable. She retains a job. She's devoted to God and her husband. And when she records her impressions of Dracula, she draws on the pseudo-scientific theories of the period.
The Count is a criminal and of criminal type, she tells Professor Van Helsing. Nordau and Lombroso would so classify him. He is of imperfectly formed mind. The Count, wishing to invade a new land, makes for London, there to satiate his bloodlust among its teeming millions and propagate his kind.
The Count creates several layers across the metropolis. 6 great wooden boxes filled with so-called mould are sent here to Chicksand Street in Whitechapel. The mould is in fact Transylvanian soil with which to line the Count's coffin bed and enable him to regenerate his powers.
It's significant that the boxes are sent to Whitechapel, an area at the time predominantly populated by Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. Bram Stoker is tapping into racial prejudice and a growing fear of immigration. Dracula is portrayed as a dangerous foreign intruder, here to drain Britain of its imperial vitality. But whether in literature, society, or the so-called social Darwinism of some scientists, racism is now being challenged, together with the very idea of empire. Victoria Park in Hackney, which rivals Hyde Park as a centre for political rallies, becomes the stage upon which a visionary campaigner imagines a new world. In the early 1890s, one speaker here began to draw increasingly larger crowds, notable not only for the content of his speeches, but also for the colour of his skin. His name was Celestine Edwards, and he was on a mission. Originally from Dominica in the West Indies, young Celestine had stowed away, aged 12, travelling the oceans for several years, before fetching up in Edinburgh in the late 1870s. As a temperance evangelist, he had ambitions to become a missionary in Africa, but instead, he came to London to study at King's College.
Slowly but surely permeating society and winning the hearts of good men.
Celestine worked as a builder's labourer to fund his studies, but he also used the money to finance the printing of penny pamphlets, which he would hand out to people who gathered here to hear him speak.
The British Empire will come to grief unless it changes its methods of dealing with the Aboriginal races. The day is coming when Africans will speak of themselves. The day is breaking, and the despised African, whose only crime is his colour, will yet give an account of himself.
Powerful words. How much of a pioneer was he?
I think he's one of the most inspirational people to come from the Victorian era. He was a solitary soldier. He's the epitome of someone who was on a mission, protesting, speaking, involved in campaigns.
Did he tour? Did he lecture?
Oh, he did, yeah. It was a real accolade when he was given the moniker as the Negro lecturer, because he was the only one at that time in the 1890s that actually there standing, whether here in Victoria Park or in the various halls around the country speaking against social Darwinism and imperialism. Wherever he spoke, hundreds would turn up to
overspill.
Overspill.
Yeah.
In 1892, he became the first ever black editor in this country, and that was through editing a journal called Lux. The remit was that black people will be able to speak for themselves in this newspaper, to kind of denounce all these theories of white superiority that came with social Darwinism and imperialism. He said that kind of if people of African descent were given the same opportunities as white people and were given time, they will be able to kind of raise their level the same as a white person. So he was basically saying that there was a lack of opportunity, which then kind of relegated people of African descent to the lower levels.
Celestine Edwards argues that racial theories are being used by the empire to justify a massive act of theft.
We think it no crime for Africans to look with suspicion upon the European who has stolen a part of their country and deluged it with rum and powder under the cover of civilization.
Edwards's mantle is taken up by a fellow West Indian and graduate of King's College called Henry Sylvester Williams. In 1897, he forms the African Association. It aims to promote and protect the interests of all subjects claiming African descent. Whilst many expect the association to be short-lived, by 1900, it's ready to hold the first Pan-African conference, here at the former Westminster Town Hall. And this is the invitation that was sent out, calling for a discussion of the native races question to be addressed by those of African descent from all parts of the British Empire, the United States of America, and several other countries too. Perhaps against all odds, the conference proves a huge success, reported widely in leading British newspapers. It's remarkable to think that here, right in the heart of the British Empire, a member of its native races had set in motion a public debate on the treatment of its oppressed subjects. As William said himself, this was the first occasion upon which black men would assemble in England and speak for themselves and endeavour to influence public opinion in their favour. These black Victorians are imagining a world where they're seen not as subject peoples or racial types, but as human beings. And their vision will reverberate throughout the coming century. The 1890s brought to the fore a range of social and cultural issues we still seem to be addressing. Questions of race, gender, and immigration. The decade was in many ways one of extremes. While the interest in scientific racism and eugenics would lead to some of the worst horrors of the 20th century, the 1890s also saw the continued march towards women's emancipation and sowed the seeds of anti-colonialism and gay liberation. And it's perhaps typical of this contradictory decade that one of its leading figures, Oscar Wilde, lingered largely forgotten in his Paris hotel room as the new century dawned. From his bed, despite great discomfort, Wilde still held court to a small coterie of loyal friends, remarking to one the immortal line, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has to go." Wilde succumbed on the 30th of November, 1900. He was 46 years old. To the Victorian establishment, Oscar Wilde had been the hideous embodiment of moral degeneracy. To his admirers, the dazzling icon of a daring aestheticism and an even more daring personal freedom. Before he died, Wilde told a friend, "I have no doubt that we shall win. But the road is long and red with monstrous martyrdoms." Next time on Victorian Sensations, psychotherapist Philippa Perry explores scientists obsessed with spirits and communication with other worlds.
It's amazing.
And witnesses the birth of new mass media using an extraordinary collection of rare Victorian films from the BFI National Archive.